Now, in today's lesson, we're talking about variation in color. Specifically, working with photographs, but it'd be the same thing if you're painting outside. You want to use colors that show the time of day, the mood, the depth in the painting, beyond just looking and copying from the photograph or from seeing outside. We'll also focus on the idea of composing these images as well. In this particular photograph, this is in Tubac, Arizona, it has a good sense of light. The light's somewhat low. This is later in the afternoon, so we have longer shadows. The light's not flat, in other words, like it is mid-morning, midday. So a good sense of light, but the problem is I have two focal points. I have too much of the house here, too much of the house here, or equal parts of the house. I want one to be dominant over the other, and they're not. A lot of contrast here, a lot of contrast here in the reddish house. It's more pink, but I don't want to say it's a pink house. So what I want to do is decide which one's more important. And for me, I would go with the red. You could do either one. If I went with the white house as more of the focal point, I would lose a lot more of the red house. And now the white house becomes more dominant and more important. And I could get a lot of color variation in the white walls of this house. If I look at it, if I'm going to pick a color from the color wheel, I would start with violet. But I would also throw in a lot of blue-greens, same value, which is the key. I wanted the same value as the shadowed wall, but I'd have blue-greens coming from the grass. I could have red-violets, even some red-oranges. The dominant color would be the blue-violet, which keeps it in the shadow and keeps it dark. But here, of course, the white house dominates in shadow. If I want to go the other way, I want the red house to dominate. And I want the foreground to dominate over the sky. In other words, I don't want equal parts sky and foreground either. So I'm going to cut back on the sky and have more foreground. So that way I'm getting off-center vertically and horizontally by deciding which house dominates and does the upper part, the sky, or the lower part of the grass dominate. And if you get half and half on all four of those, you're going to have everything centered. So if I crop this, now the red house dominates and the white house is just kind of a suggestion. Kind of offsets, it puts the red house further back because there's depth there. So either way you go, and there's more ways to crop this than just that. So I want to think in terms of color to suggest more mood. The photograph gives me a basic green. It doesn't even give me much yellow green, blue green, green green. It's just basic green. There's some yellow green in here, some blue green in the shadows. But I really need to push that. And even beyond that, I want orange greens, purple greens. I can get a lot of violet in these shadows in the foreground. A lot of orange, red-violet, warm yellow greens in this tree up here. I can have a warm blue-green in the tree here and a cold or cool blue-green in the shadows over here. Now, so you can really push the color beyond what's there. And you really have to, I think, to make it a painting. Even with some of the suggestion of these background, or I can create background trees in here just to show some depth. I can really go as blue or as blue-green as I want. Because I'm trying to show depth. I'm not trying to copy the photograph. Now, I don't have to go that blue. I could keep it more of a green with some violet scrubbed in it, anything to push it back. But I'm not tied to the photograph. So in the sunlight, a good rule of thumb is in the sunlight, push your greens, whether you're going to focus on yellow-green in the sunlight or a green-green in the sunlight, push them towards warmer colors. Orange, red-orange, even some red, even though red isn't necessarily warm. You have to warm it. Red's kind of neutral, and so is green. So I need to push it more towards yellows, yellow, oranges, orange to make a warm red. Or I need to push it more towards the blues and violets to make it a cool red. So think in terms of temperature and varying the color to get colors that create a mood and a sense of light instead of just a photograph. I like some of the color in this, the nice color variation in the foreground with these wildflowers growing, but there's not much here color-wise. That's why sometimes making a black and white That way you can really focus on values and get your values better and have a set of colors you're going to use, whether it's, a warm and cool of all three primaries or just three primaries and white. Whatever color you want to use, come up with colors in these values with what you have on the palette, not necessarily what's in the photograph. That doesn't mean you can't, the photograph does give us a place to start color-wise, maybe, if we want to, but it doesn't have to. Focus on the values and focus on temperature and come up with whatever colors you want. Vary the colors as much as possible. Looking at another one here. This was in Missouri, Mennonite Farm. This needs to be cropped. The idea that it's too much of everything. In other words, the whole wagon and the whole horses. In other words, nothing is cropped. Everything is shown. So I want to decide which one's more important. I want, the wagon and the horses, this lighter horse with the saddle. And again, do I want more foreground or more sky? You can crop it till you get half and half of both, and that kind of kills the composition. So I'm going to go with the whole horse with the saddle, more foreground, and lose some of the wagon. This way I'm not shoving everything into the picture plane. It just goes static when you do that. But when you have one of the objects running off, and of course the horses, I have the whole horses in there, I'm not cropping them, but letting something run off the canvas gives a lot more sense of space. Plus the horses become bigger and more important, whereas in this view they're smaller, and actually the fields and the trees and the grass become a bit more important because it's just so big. Also thinking in terms of value, adjust this image. The minute you get rid of the color, you really see where the contrast lies and where the focal point is, and you can adjust that. Obviously, the dark horses are going to be darkest, and my focal point can, combine two of the horses, or the wagon and the horses, so whichever way you want to go there. A lot of options, compositionally and color-wise. I think more than anything, what the photograph gives us is the values, where the light is, how it's hitting objects, but not so much the color. And certainly not the composition. The last one here, this is a winter sunset, really strong color. This has a kind of a nice color sense and a real extreme warm, cool color scheme. Kind of yellow, orange, and blue violet. Kind of a complementary color scheme and really gives that sense of sunlight and shadow. So that's what I would play off here color-wise. Is variations of yellow and variations of blue, or variations of yellow-orange, variations of blue-violet. I would pick those colors, stay up here, anywhere from, yellow-orange to kind of red-violet in the sky. And then down in here, in the snow, anywhere from blue-green to blue-violet. Of course, a lot of green and blue-green involved in the trees. And then compositionally, this is really cut down the middle pretty good. It's, this line here separates everything. And pretty much the horizon line is in the middle too. So this is very symmetric. And I want to get away from that. So decide more sky or more snow. And the more I can focus on one or the other, I want to get the sunset out of the middle. So which side is more important, the left side or the right side of the trees or the left side? So I'm going to go more with the left side and crop the right side. And I'm going to go more with the sky and crop the snow. I don't want the trees sitting on the bottom edge, so I need some kind of foreground in there. And I might have a bit more foreground than this. That zooms in more, focuses more on an area that's more important. Also with this image, what interests me is the fallen snow on the trees. Aside from the contrast, a real warm sky and cool shadows in the snow in the trees. So first thing I want to do is pull together some of this detail. It's just too busy. And I would pull it together in the light snow and the dark green. I just did this area right in here, didn't do all the trees, but you can see just pulling that together a little bit. This is just too busy. Same size strokes, same size clumps of snow and trees. So getting two values of the greens, both of them dark, but one a little bit lighter. So I have two values in the shadow, and eventually two values in the snow, but a lot more subtle. The snow up on top here, which is more against the light sky, is going to be darker, and the snow down here is going to appear a bit lighter. And I'll have deeper shadow on the snow as it goes back into the tree, and slightly lighter shadow as it comes forward. So I have at least two values on the snow, two values in the tree. And then same thing in the background. The value changes are a lot more evident. But I got the sunset off-center, trees off-center a little bit. This tree's a bit centered, but that doesn't bother me as much because this whole area here is almost like one clump. But it's not so symmetrical. I think it reads a lot better. There we go. There's black and white. You know, once you turn into black and white, suddenly there's no sunset anymore because the values really don't change in the black and white and the color. What it is a temperature change. The intensity of the yellow against the slightly more muted yellow. You know, there's not much value change in the sky. It's just sky and clouds, but that temperature is what really changes. So it's more of a color change that gives me variation in here more than the value change. And also in the foreground, using those clumps of snow to lead the eye more into the painting rather than out of it. So pulling some of these clumps in here and kind of directing the eye. You don't have to be really obvious about it. That might be a little obvious, but still it does pull the viewer's eye in as opposed to not having. So think more color variation and really focus on how to arrange these shapes, making sure you're not symmetrical, centered horizontally or vertically. And when you have two focuses, like the houses, the horses, really decide which one's more important and crop one. Now looking at a couple of paintings, this is a painting by Frederick Mulhaupt, early California Impressionist on the East Coast. A lot of variation of color in here. You might even say it's a bit busy, but it's not detail busy because when we look at it black and white, he doesn't have a lot of small value changes. What he does have is color change. And you can have a lot of color change that's the same value. These values are real close here. So it's more about color change than value change. And value change is what gives us detail. And too much of that can really be a problem. So you can see the sense of light here. You can see it more with the color, but the black and white really sets up the light. The color is what pushes the temperature and gives it a stronger sense of light. But his variation of color really runs the gamut. A lot of strong color in here, but his good use of values keeps that color, I think, from just overrunning the painting. So focus on the values as much as possible and then see the variation of color. Because variation of color doesn't necessarily mean a lot of value change. It just means using more color, but simpler values. This is a Edward, is it Edward or Henry? I think it's Edward Potthast, and I may not be pronouncing that either, but he's an American Impressionist, early 20th century, late 19th. And I got several of his paintings here. But again, not much value change in the water. The foam in the water is a big value change, but it's more subtle color change. And water's not blue. And trees aren't always green. It's, here the water is a yellow-orange and yellow-green with some blue in it. But it's the value changes and the flow of the brushwork that makes it read more as water. This is another Edward Potthast. Not a lot of value change. There's probably 3 values of dark in the rocks, 3 values of shadow, and then 2 to 3 values in the light. So very simple values, but a lot of color. A lot of color in the shadow. And as long as he keeps it cooler than the color in the light, it's going to work. You can have simple value changes, but a lot of color create more interest. And within the shadows, you can have warm colors. He's got a warm orange there, but that warm orange in the shadow is still cooler than the sunlit oranges. And that's the key. It just has more yellow in it, where the shadowed orange, of course, is darker, but has a bit of blue or blue-violet in it. So the key is, I can have cool light areas, sunlit areas, like there's a violet there, but overall it has to be warmer than the shadow. But there's a lot of color in the shadows here, and I think one of the problems is we tend to want to be able to see the color before we mix it. He establishes all the shadow with one color, whether he established all with this kind of slightly muted violet and then came in with these varied colors. But he's not trying to copy what he sees. He's using his understanding, his knowledge of the palette to suggest color variation. Some of it might be because of reflected light, sunlight hitting in here in front and bouncing into the shadow here. But he's not copying what he's seeing. He's using what he's looking. I imagine he's painted this outside. He's looking at what he sees and interprets it more with the colors on his palette. And I imagine if he had painted this again, it would look different. You don't always come up with the same color sense in each painting. You might respond differently to what you're seeing. So in other words, there's no right or wrong for these colors he has in the shadow. The right or wrong comes in the value, how dark or light it is, and how warm and cool it is. But I can have any color in the shadows as long as the value's right and the temperature's right. This is another one of his. Again, a lot of color, but what matters more than anything is the value. Separating the plains, the trees being darker than the flat plain, shadows darker than the light areas, and so on. Very simple values, but a lot of color. A lot of variation of color in there. So the grass isn't just green. There's orange, there's some red violet, blue-green, yellow-green. A lot of color in there. And the trees aren't just green either. There's a lot of violet, red violet, yellow, yellow-orange, yellow-green in there. So really think in terms of variation. So one more of his very simple shapes. Not a lot of value changes in this one at all. But still, some color variation, variations of violet in the background and variations of darker blues and blue violets here in the foreground and blue greens. So it's not the details that are going to make the painting work. It's getting the right values, the right temperature, but also color variation to really create more interest.